Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to kick off the evening session and to, in some ways, I was going to say conclude the transformation imperative. I think in some ways begin the transformation imperative. As we reach the end of this series, I find it particularly fitting that we gather here in this room. One, because I love the room, and two, because Banny Banerjee bookending Roger Martin feels like we've had giants in the field bless this hall with great thinking. For many of us, frankly, for me, I think that Professor Banerjee is sort of the intellectual godfather of much of what is coming out of Stanford Design School and really teaching the world what design thinking is about. I found it interesting that Roger Martin grappled with what design thinking can offer, especially in higher education. And very similarly to the word entrepreneurship, I have found in many places design thinking becomes a buzzword. And because something that it sounds cool, but most people don't understand and use in disparate and strange ways. I think that's a mistake in some ways. For us to experiment is important. For us to be intellectually rigorous about how we frame this education in a time of incredible economic turmoil in higher education makes it more important that colleges and universities and professors and provosts and deans be rigorous about our intent. And for me, design thinking is a particular function at Philadelphia University. In practice at PhilaU, design thinking insists on a transdisciplinary approach to problem solving. That logically leads you to believe it must stem from transdisciplinary education. I think many universities are missing that point, but not here. And it is why here we insist on a university-wide approach to the way we teach. I'm as excited as I am about the DEC curriculum, Design, Engineering, and Commerce, which puts all three of these disciplines together and all three of this disparate approaches to problem solving together. It is the organic growth of what we call nexus learning that I am most impressed with. The faculty in the College of Architecture and the Built Environment and the faculty in the College of Science, Health, and the Liberal Arts have organically grown their programs to reach across disciplines within their own college, but then to reach across the colleges for incredible levels of innovative curriculum. Our health students working with our industrial design students to solve particular problems for individuals in the healthcare field. That doesn't happen at most places, but it makes me believe that here, and maybe this is a bit subjective, here more than other places, we really believe this is the right kind of education. It is not just good, it's really important. There's a study by Stephen Tipper of Vanderbilt that he looked at double majors, students who did double majors and then tracked their careers and saw how many were focused on problem solving and how much success they gained. And he saw very little support from colleges and universities for students to do that. It was very difficult for students to navigate the bureaucracy to become double majors. Only 9% of students in the United States do that. We have purposely put bureaucratic boundaries in front of students achieving at a higher level. That is a shocking finding. I'm fond of quoting Ron Kander, who was fond of quoting Socrates. We have great lineage here, my friend.
2 degrees of separation.
And yeah, over time we will take credit for the quote too. We've got to get a historian here. He likes to quote Socrates in explaining the root for an educational shift and a need for nexus learning. Education is not the filling of a vessel. It is the kindling of a flame. I think that's inspirational. And I think he's right. If our students leave with just a bunch of knowledge in their heads, we failed them. Our faculty and staff have to be dedicated to this approach that gives them the skills to really go make decisions far into the future. I think it is just really special that we have one of the world's thought leaders on design thinking and a man who has inspired a change in higher education emanating out of Stanford to be with us tonight, and so fitting that he does it in this room as the bookend of a great series. I would ask Provost to come here and introduce Professor Banerjee.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I've gotten to know Banny really well over the last 2 or 3 years, 3 or 4 years. We've done a lot together. I've been out to some of his workshops and events out at Stanford, and we were in Italy this fall at the Global Innovation Forum for innovation leaders. And every time I do anything with Banny, I always feel refreshed and kind of ready to start my career anew afterward. That's the kind of person he is. Really has had an extraordinary impact at Stanford. Director of the D School. Now he is director of the Design for Change Lab is what they call it. But what this is doing is taking on, and this will warm your heart, Robin, he's taking on the big issues of the environment, the big issues of sustainability, the big issues of social change, and trying to kind of understand how to approach them and enact systemic and sustained change by applying various modalities of design thinking. And I really respect the scale and the ambition and the aspiration of that. We need to be doing more of that. Lots of systems thinking in there. Before he came to Stanford, he worked at IDEO and was a designer, design strategist, worked in California, worked in India. He's at Stanford now, in sort of typical fashion for people like Banny. He stands between many disciplines. For the Design for Change Labs, he is talking, and I have some things, he is talking to faculty and working between faculty in the behavioral sciences, social economics, system analysis, management science, engineering, and art. And he's doing all that to generate new platforms for applying design thinking to these large problems. I want to thank Banny for your support, your help, and mentorship over the last 3 or 4 years as we've tried to put together this crazy, ambitious College of Design Engineering and Commerce, and then tried to take that ambition and bring it to the rest of the university. You've been a real source of inspiration for me and support, and I do appreciate it. And I know the rest of our community has heard your name a lot and appreciates it too. So with that, welcome, Banny. Thank you so much for your participation, and I hope you're going to stay in touch with us for years and years.
I think we need a hug.
Oh, yeah.
That was an exceptionally generous introduction. I don't think I nearly deserve that level of generosity, but I'll take it. I must say the privilege is entirely mine, because I've known Randy for now, over 2 years, and I've heard of you, Steve, through Randy. And I think that what we have here is extraordinarily special. I think what you're doing out here is extremely iconic and is the end of a spear that is going to completely reshape education as we know it at a time that education desperately needs changing. So I've been trying to do what Randy has actually been doing in my own university. But you can imagine that it's a little bit like pushing a mountain. But if I were a little bit like Randy, I would probably have made a whole lot more progress. He's all action. So I represent a community of people in Stanford who has been trying to push innovation into students who are actually coming there to study design and innovation, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, but also to students from across the university, but increasingly to stakeholders who are not members of the Stanford in formal manners, but a part of a larger community. And I'd like to share some of what we are doing there and how we think about it. So first and foremost, we buy into this statement that in going into the future, innovation is going to be a supremely important facet for any economy. And it's something that we take really, really seriously. But innovation has so many different definitions and so many different points of view as to what it constitutes, all the way from people who think that it is being creative to being implementing something that makes a difference. And we have a point of view, and essentially it's saying that it is outperforming normative modes. Whatever the normative modes are, how do you outperform them in order to create a whole range of new kind of outcomes, including new behaviors and new behavior of systems, shifting frames entirely, and coming up with possibilities that did not exist before. So you're outperforming whatever tools happen to be the normative ones. But we also believe that this is not just a process, and it's not just a set of tool sets or skill sets, but it is a mindset. It's a way of operating, it's a way of life. And if you have that mindset, you would not just bring it to your problems and big projects and so on. You would bring it to making an omelet. You would just, you would bring it to everything. And so then, given that that's the position we take, the question for us, the few of us who are in charge of designing these curricula and so on, is how do we create these mindsets, right? And I'm preaching to the choir, so a lot of it is going to be extremely familiar to you, but I'll share the flavor that we tend to reinforce. So first and foremost, we believe that you're not bound in a discipline. You're post-disciplinary, and you're at the nexus of very many different disciplines, the different domains. You're at the nexus of the human issues, the technology issues, the business issues, but much more importantly, in the larger backdrop of large sociological issues and circumstantial issues, and the ability to look at the context in which you're working in is also very, very important. So how does that fall into what it looks like? It looks a little bit like this, where we believe that the whole thing of innovation and leadership, because for us, innovation is a way, teaching people how to be innovative is also an ability to essentially turn the key on leadership modalities. Everything that we do, we see as a stealth intervention or an overt intervention into new forms of leadership. So first and foremost, we feel that there is a lot that you need to go away with in terms of your own confidence, etc. But going forward, you'll need to learn how to play in a team sport, and we are going to need to know how to create the team dynamics. And so we train people in doing this, and we get them to be absolutely superb players no matter where they started. So this is something we have a whole science around. But I think this is another thing that's happening, which is that we are messing with their identities. We have them for a short period of time, no matter whether they're in for the undergraduate program or the graduate program. And what is really on the anvil is their mental models of themselves and where they think they're headed and their sense of agency for themselves. So if we can somehow give them a very, very tight spin while they're there, and no matter where they came from, and have them think in terms of being leaders in the making and change agents, then it's a little bit like what Steve said. It's not trying to fill a vessel, but we are lighting a fire, right? Kindling a fire. So that comes with giving people creative confidence. So we time and again put them in positions where they're a little panic-stricken on day one at the sight of the design brief, and then they feel all extremely proud a few weeks later when they're downstream of it. And we constantly put them in a position where the path looking forward is extremely ambiguous, and they're given the task of carving cubes out of fog, right? Where it's very foggy, and in hindsight, they're being given tools to look at what their path has been. So it's a little bit like walking into a cornfield where the corn is taller than your head and you don't quite know where you're going. But looking back, it's crystal clear as to why you made those turns and so on. But much more importantly, when you get to a point where you're stuck, that is not an unfamiliar feeling. That is actually kindles a certain kind of excitement, saying, I've been here before, I know how to solve this. And I know how to get unstuck, and I have heaps of ideas where the first one came from. And that creative confidence also comes from the act of building. So you're not just coming up with the thinking, you're not just coming up with slideware, you're actually prototyping things and so on and seeing how it works, and that gives a tremendous amount of confidence. So that is why I would say that even if challenges are not physical in nature, in one fashion or the other, we try to create a set of circumstances where the person is going to want to build. They might build a film. They might build a completely new strategy. They might come up with a test. But there is an act of building involved, because it's in the act of building that they're essentially doing a 360 and all the forces that converge on that particular problem. So in a sense, it's like doing I call it helical cognition, where you're doing a 360, but you're coming up ahead just like a spring. So instead of a very linear, sequential way of thinking, you're forced to look at all the various ways in which you can pivot on different planes. And so you're looking at the future, you're looking at the past, you're looking at the usability, you're looking at the technology all at once. This is, of course, something that all of us, in this room, I think, live and breathe, which is the degree to which we are human-centered. We believe that instead of celebrating one's own capabilities or one's own technology, it is extremely important to assume a position of cultivated naivete, and no matter how much you think you know what's going on in the person's head, you actually go into the context and see for yourself. And when I was a consultant, I've done a whole lot of work for very high-level people, either C-suite people or senior VPs and so on. And they've been in a business for 30, 40 years sometimes. And they feel they know their context inside and out, and they know how to make their strategic directives. And then we haul them into the field and have them meet their own clients. And literally, you can see the light bulb going off in top of their heads. And this is something that I wasn't trained in originally, because I was trained as an architect, where you're taught to essentially think that you can enforce your vision on other people, because what do they know about architecture, right? That's how I was trained, right? And later on, much later, I came into this somewhat reluctantly. I was dragged into this kicking and moaning, right? But now that I've seen what a difference it makes to really look at the underlying the forces and the underlying things, what you can observe is, of course, just the tip of the iceberg. But once you make an acquaintance with what lies under, that's where so much of your insight comes from, and that makes a difference between whether it's going to be a spectacular success or a crashing failure. So it's become a little bit of a religion, and essentially any student who comes up with some kind of a design proposition, we have a 3-stage question where you say, okay, so you've done this, that's great. So you're telling us what it is. So why did you do it? So there's the reason under it. And then we say, so what? If you did it, what are the implications of what you've done? So this is part of what gives us the underlying sensibilities and the directives as to what to do. But then we create this other thing, which is the so what, which is, okay, you've been very clever, it's very, very smart, and it had a rationale behind it, but as a black box, if you come up with it, how is it ever going, what good is it to man or beast, is essentially the question we are asking. And so essentially they get, the students go back and forth between what's on the anvil and what the impact they're going to make. But we have, I would say that it goes without saying that just like everything out here, we really, really believe in problem-based learning. This is something that we are so past the point of debating that we don't even think of mentioning it. But there are different categories of problem-based learning, and one of them is a very artificial project, which is designing, like thinking about the forces of in a prosthetic knee or some such thing. But you can, as you come into this other realm, which is extremely real, there's one end, that other end of the spectrum is where it's a real project in a real context with a real stakeholder, and if the student does a good job, it will be implemented. It's real in every which way. And you actually are affecting people's lives. So the stakes get higher and higher, and the kind of learning you can get is unparalleled compared to what you can teach through a slide deck. So we are veering more and more towards that. And in doing that, we are forging very unusual relationships, I would say fairly radical relationships with industry and governments and NGOs and so on. So here is a car that was built by some of my students. It was a fully working drive-by-wire electric vehicle that they built in 10 weeks. But this was the 10th prototype. They built a prototype every week. Every week it was taken apart or new parts were brought in, and the damn thing ran, right? But it's silly in many ways, but they were essentially asking, why does someone get into a 2-ton vehicle just to get milk in suburban America? And why can't you have something like a bus where people can hop in and go with you, et cetera, et cetera? It doesn't matter what the project was. What's interesting is that those people are heads of very big automobile industries, right? Those people are essentially C-level people of 2 different automobile industries, essentially considering the questions. So it's those things that essentially creates an environment of discourse that we find very, very useful. And then there is this, which is the not just going through the process of innovating, but having the metacognition to ask yourself, what is the process behind it, and making such a deep acquaintance with the different parts of the process that you can hack the process. So essentially what you're saying is that, okay, within our minds are very, very different cognitive modes, modalities, and given any challenge, you want to be able to step through different modalities. And you also want to phase lock the modality between in the team as you go through it. So and that's a process. And so how can you amplify that kind of thinking that's most necessary at this kind of stage? And if you get students to think about that and being conscious about that, then you can actually talk about it at the level of process and veer the solutions towards much more strategic ends. So here's another thing, which is extremely radical co-creation. So co-creation, as opposed to just collaboration or even coming together to cooperate. Cooperate is something that is somewhat we scoff at, because that's essentially saying that, okay, you're not going to kill the other person, right? And collaboration in our minds often, or interdisciplinary work often lands up being a whole bunch of experts who represent different disciplines sitting around the table and agreeing to agree. And the intersection set between their rubrics might be minuscule or non-existent, but they stay within their own rubrics. This is a very different beast. This is where you are using the team together to come up with something completely new, and I'll speak about this a little bit more. But the other thing that we are finding is that this is not just a specialization. I teach a freshman seminar class called Think Like a Designer, and this class now has, I just let in 20 students only because one of the functions of a freshman seminar class is that the students really get to know the professor and you build a bond with them, right? But I'm beginning to get 300 applications for that 20-person class. And it's ridiculous. I have to spend 30 hours selecting the students, and of course, there is no way of selecting, or they're all great, right? But what I'm finding is that this is something that is transforming the students, and there's no credit to me. Anyone could stand in my place and teach that class. but there's a transformational aspect to this because that process that we are teaching them applies to everything, but it has the ability to generate new kind of questions about their role and themselves, their destiny, and the choices they're making, and what they how they can bring that creativity to anything that they do. So those same students come back to me and saying, guess what, I use design thinking for my essay. Guess what, I use my design thinking for my math exam. And it's just brilliant. He says, guess what, I use design thinking to fix fences with my dad, with whom I've had a really bad relationship. It's just amazing, right? And this and other things, the success of this class and other things that are happening on campus suddenly has the provost of Stanford and the VPUE, the vice provost of undergraduate education and so on, coming and trying to get me to make this into a university-wide class and scaling it and so on. They're thinking of having design thinking be something like numeracy, where everybody knows how to add and divide. But this is something we at Stanford, I can only hope to aspire for. You guys are pulling it off, right? So it's amazing what you guys are doing. I'm really, really excited to be here. The other thing that I'm finding is that the research ability of undergraduates are hugely underleveraged. These guys are fantastic. Like I had one research project with 3 PhD students, and along came another 3 undergraduate students, and the undergraduate students ran rings around the PhD students. They got done in 1 quarter that the PhD students hadn't managed to do in 2 years. It was just unbelievable, right? So suddenly I'm just realizing, and they learned a whole lot. They learned all sorts of aspects, and they made it much more applied, et cetera, et cetera. So this was a really fantastic experience for me. And then what I started doing is I started raising small amounts of money and essentially passing it on to undergraduate students and saying, here's $5,000, right? And I wouldn't advertise that I have $5,000. I'd put all sorts of stage gates where they had to, come and bug me 15 times and ask me for this and ask me for that, and they had to raise some money themselves, etc. But these guys, like with that seed money, they were going and raising $30,000, etc. It was just amazing to watch. It's not something that I just feel that this is something that is shaping a very new modality among undergraduate students. But ultimately, I think that what we are about is building extremely strong cultures and communities, because once you belong to that place, 10 years later, you remember who you went to school with, you pick up the phone and call people for help, you create an ecosystem, and essentially, you are not there alone. And it gives you so much courage to do something very, very brave, right? You don't think that you're sticking your neck out because, first of all, there are all these buddies you know of who are also sticking their necks out. But meanwhile, when you get into trouble, you know who to call, right? So this is the community feeling, and the shared lexicon and the shared value systems goes a tremendously long way. So in terms of lexicon, the D School, which is actually not a school, it's an institute, the Hasse-Plattner Institute of Design, essentially that has a function of taking design thinking to all comers. So graduate students from all around the campus, and now it's beginning to go into the undergraduate level as well, essentially come to the D School, take classes that are all team-based, problem-based, design thinking-based, and team taught. And the team teaching is actually brilliant because you have 2 professors who come from different fields who the students see arguing in front of them. And that's really important because then they realize that there is no one truth, and they have to figure out what the truth is. So they're actually seeing that, wait, these guys don't quite agree, and their epistemologies are different, their ontologies are different, their rubrics are different, and there's a metacognition of what they're about, and their epistemology that starts that taking shape in their own heads, and that's very important for us because part of design thinking is the ability to ask questions and cut through rules and create new rules. But it also helps us do these things, which is ask very, very big problems. So this, incidentally, is the slide I typically use to use Robin's work as a case study, which is when you have a very large problem and all those fleets of cars that are sitting out there for large parts of the day, and all of them represent a tremendous amount of embodied energy. It's the energy that it took to mine the materials from the earth and deliver it to your door. What are we doing with this fleet? And if you take students and talk about these kind of issues, then they learn how to do systems thinking, and they think of how you can create extremely hybrid systems with human systems and technology systems and so on. But we also have a lot of experimental classes. So a lot of the faculty have a lot of license in coming up with completely new kind of classes and trying them on for size. So this is a class, and as you can see, the way the classroom look like are probably like the spaces that you have out here, where even what people are doing in the class are not quite standard. So a lot of classes where the class is the platform to figure out new thinking, where you don't have a priori theories that have been tested, etc. It is through the class that a new thinking is emerging, and it's full disclosure with the students and their partners in creating that. And at the end of every class, you are having meetings with the students to say, okay, where are we headed next? What are we going to do? What is your suggestion? What are you going to teach on week 6? So it's a very, very deep partnership with the students, and these are really fun to teach, and it's fun for the students as well. But ultimately, it gets them, it allows them to get comfort with ambiguity. These are extremely open-ended challenges. There is no deterministic pathway to solving them, and they realize that in the solution path, there really is no deterministic way of figuring out what is the optimal path, because any question ramifies into an infinite set of pathways leading to nodes that further ramify into infinite set of pathways. So you have to develop in an entirely new way. And this is particularly hard for students who come in from, let's say, engineering and so on, where they've done beam calculations where, unless they get 3 decimals right, they get an F, right? So it's a very different way. They have to rewire their heads. But I think this is another thing. We celebrate failure. We think that it is absolutely ludicrous to imagine that there are pathways to success that are not corner cases, that are actually median cases where you can get to success without failure. It's just a ludicrous position to take. There is no pathway to success without going through failure. So you better understand failure, learn from failure, and make friends with failure. And I think that in my views, this is one of the secrets of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley really, really understands failure. So unlike a lot of other cultures, like in Germany, if you did a startup and you failed, your family would not ever speak about it. They would shove it under the rug. But in Silicon Valley, the subtext is that I had the guts to try. What did you have the guts to do, right? So in a sense, the fact that you failed is the mark of having had the guts to try. And the thing that we tell our students is that give us a spectacular success or a spectacular failure. You'll get fantastic grades. Just don't bore us, right? So when there's a good failure, we actually really get into the failure and say, so what can we learn from it? So it's something that we really understand, and that essentially, of course, supports the whole notion of rapid prototyping, where you prototype and you identify failures early in order to get really robust solutions. So that all the failure modes are weeded out early, rather than you having to put Band-Aid over Band-Aid when you've invested too much, right? So of course, essentially, design is one of the most profound ways of asking questions. And the question is, of course, much, much more profound than the answers, because the world is surfeit with people who know how to create answers once the question has been posed. It's the posing of the question which is bloody hard. So we are essentially training people how to do this. And in the simplified way, there's a larger, much, much larger and nuanced process. But essentially what we are doing is this. We are creating ways in which to to generate new insights from ethnography work, from doing root cause analysis, going into the field, doing all sorts of stakeholder analysis, etc. From having done that, we allow the students to go against the brief and reframe the problem. So we say that, okay, we gave you the problem based on our understanding of what it should be. You tell us what the problem brief really should have been from having found that out. And based on that, they create a large number of concepts and prototypes that are then tested, that then give you insights again, and it goes in a spiral. But the most important thing is not losing sight of what the question is. So if you are, there's a case that I can talk about later, but essentially it's a team of students who are given the problem of designing a very, very low-cost incubator for developing countries, because low birth weight babies is infant mortality due to low birth weight babies are a huge problem. And they did a spectacular job, but they did a spectacular job because they did not mistake one question for the other. They did not say, how do we make a cheaper incubator? They said, how do we keep babies alive? That was the real question. And it made all the difference, right? So essentially what we are doing is innovating on the problem domain and the solution domain. And instead of going sequentially from the problem domain, getting a lock on what the problem is and then solving it, we believe that taking a crack at the solution is one of the best ways of understanding what the problem is. So we go back and forth between the problem domain and the solution domain. And essentially, as you go back and forth, the level of fidelity of your solutions go higher and higher, but a lot of the failure modes are weeded out, but a much more nuanced sense of the problem, of what the problem is generated. But what we also find is that this exact thing is essentially a new mode of leadership. And I have a lot of conversations with deans of business school about exactly this issue. And if you just think about all the celebrated leaders that we talk about, the Steve Jobs and the Eric Schmidts of the world, they're actually exhibiting a very different behavior than what the business schools have traditionally called leadership. Because the leadership, the standard form of leadership looks a little bit like this, right? And it comes from the military. And the model came from the military and was reinforced during the Industrial Revolution, where thinking was centralized and it was extremely hierarchical, right? So we are reinventing what leadership is, and we are not saying that leadership is a position. We are saying leadership is a modality. If you can be a leader when you're 19, and you can be a far better leader than anyone who's been in a leadership position for 60 years. And a modern day definition of leadership is also, how do you bring out innovation in others? How do you distribute leadership and get large groups of people to bring that innovation into the fold? That is the real mark of innovation, right? Rather than just show innovation yourself. So in short, it is making a very, very clear distinction between these two, of having a process to figure out what is the right thing to do, and then having a process to figure out how to do it right, but not rush into doing it right without having done the former. Because you could do an absolutely spectacular job of polishing a result that is answering the wrong question. And of course, it's about making this distinction, which is, are you managing the present? And is your entire perceptual lens embedded in your view of the current crises, or are you in the business of shaping the future? So this is something, of course, you do. It's not as if you're not managing the present. It's just that don't take the eye off that other ball, which you're really in charge of, which is crafting the future. So essentially, a lot, as you see, what we do is highly experiential. It's very, very problem-based learning. It's tacit learning. You learn by doing. You learn by failing. There's a pie chart that you have of being a student, being a teacher, being a doer, and the professor and the student are not like this, but like this, maybe. And sometimes the professor is saying, you seem to know more about this than me. Tell me. Why don't you replace me in class? Because you seem to have more experience about this. I've just read about this. You have done it, right? So those roles are very, very fungible, but that allows us to make this distinction between people just complying with what we are saying or identifying with what we are saying, but much more importantly, getting to the point where they really, really internalize that, and they don't even know why they do it, to the point where there's enough metacognition out there that they can speak about it, but it comes naturally to them, right? It's a little bit like a really, really good athlete knowing exactly where everybody else is and where the ball is and having ball sense. It's like creating ball sense, right? But our view of the student is this. It's essentially creating a multitude of capacities. Feet on the ground, heads in the cloud, thinking in different modalities, thinking with your brain, thinking with your gut, thinking with your heart, but also extremely open. You grab whatever tools you are, but much more importantly, you can collaborate with others who are not like yourself. So that, in a sense, captures what we are trying to build, right? There is pragmatism, but there is also this dreaming about the future and dreaming about possibilities. So it's all about uncovering the questions that conventions and mediocrity tends to obscure, and we are conditioned into thinking that that's the only possibility. But everything is on the anvil. Just like the workshop that we were doing today, we're putting the entire university system on the anvil. What a fantastic problem to work on, right? But given that we are asking this question, let's ask a few questions about the future, right? I think that I don't know if all of you share this viewpoint, but I believe that we've arrived at a very, very critical and tense moment in the history of our civilization. We've created a civilization where we felt that what we draw from the buffer and the resources that we actually depend on are unlimited, and that creates the bedrock of our assumption of our civilization. And well, those assumptions have proven to be not quite true. So now we've designed ourselves into a box, and a lot of our challenges have positive feedback loops, which means that the change creates further change, and they're exponential changes. But meanwhile, what we know how to do are those kind of changes at the best of times. What we know how, that's something that's a success case, that blue line, right? But that essentially begs the question about what are we going to do about the gap? There's a certain inevitability about that gap that is actually a really concerning issue. So let's look at what are the 18-year-olds who are in our classes. When they get to be 35, and those of us who've crossed 35, we know that it seemed like yesterday that we were 18 years old, right? It seemed like just the other day. But there's going to be 1 more billion people on the planet. That's as many people as it took from the beginning of time to the 1820s, right? That many people are going to get added in the next 17 years. We are going to need 40% more fresh water. We are going to need 50% more food, 45% more energy. If we are to meet any kind of semblance of climate change targets, we're going to have to reduce the CO2 effective emissions by 50%. And the next one, we don't even have a hope of trying to really affect, which is really makes me very sad about this, which is that the natural order of the number of species that go extinct every year is in the tune of 18 to 20, and we are losing about 100,000, right? So it's orders and orders of magnitude, and depending on the calculation, some people will tell you 30,000, some people will say 300,000, because we don't know how many species there are. All we know is that there is a mass extinction going on, right? And a lot of people will come out of abject poverty, but we'll still have somewhere between 750 million is still in abject poverty. And the people who come out of poverty are not going to escape the social ills that come with poverty. They're still going to be trapped in other issues that might not constitute the textbook case of poverty. So some of the megatrends that all of you are familiar with, but let me just go down this just so we can frame what we are up against, is that what has come to pass is that we've learned that the economies are extremely fragile, and There's a very high rate of unemployment everywhere, and that is not just a passing trend. That this kind of reality, the fragility is here to stay. Very, very uncertain futures of essential things that we depend on, such as food and water and energy. Very, very connected global systems but with very sharp inequities, which if you really think about it is a very messy situation. Political instabilities and geopolitical shifts, very rapidly shifting markets and technology regimes. So essentially there's in the yesteryears and the way corporate decision making and business decisions have been made is with an inbuilt understanding that if you build an empire, it's there to stay, right? But what seems to be happening is that first of all, the clock tick of change has become much, much faster, but competitors are coming out of nowhere. And so that creates a very different environment for people who worry about markets. And then we have the biggies, like climate change that used to be in everybody's backyard, but it's no longer in everybody's backyard. It's coming into, even in short-term issues, it's beginning to make its presence felt. And then, of course, the massive, we are already at 1.4 times the carrying capacity of the planet, and we're going to add 2 more billion in the next, this many years till in the next 30 years, and that's a serious issue. And of course, like I said, so this is a very doomsday scenario, right? And there's an argument for being very optimistic and not talking about the doomsday issue and so on, but there's also an argument for calling a spade, right? And I would say I'm an extremely concerned optimist in the sense that if I really were to be very pragmatic and being a realist, I don't think I'd be able to get out of bed, right? But the fact that I've got out of bed, I have no option but to say, okay, we're going to do something about it, damn it, right? So just there is a philosophical stance where we feel that, okay, we have to find ways. There is no other option, right? And so let's look at some other things that are changing. And these are rapidly generated lists. You can add 50 more points to it. But essentially, it's largely agreed that most of our students will have jobs that don't exist yet. So we have no idea what we are teaching them for, right? A lot of learning happening outside the walls of education. A huge amount of education is happening, which we are not providing, we have no control over. A global workplace with very, very multicultural teams. This is something I'm already dealing with. All our teams are working across geographic boundaries, etc., especially given the issues that they are working on. The clock tick of change is ever faster, and it's going to get faster and faster. The grand challenges is going to affect our lives and our work, and it's something that is beginning to affect our work in many, many different ways. I think that if you think of the paradigm of exponential changes, and you just look at what Moore's law means, it means that, you've heard that paradigm about the king who asked somebody he was pleased with about what he wants, and they said, oh, why don't you put a 1 grain of rice on the first square of a chessboard and 2 on the next, and so on. And suddenly you realize that by the time you get to the 64th, the pile of rice would be roughly the size of Mount Everest, right? And what the interesting thing is that if you just cut the board into the first line or the second line, it still looks innocuous. But there's a point at which all hell breaks loose, right? It's a little bit like that with information access and communities. I think that we are on the cusp of something unprecedented. With that level of communication, that level of connectedness, and those abilities to create global communities, we are going to see phenomena that are very, very different. The other thing that's going to happen is that people are going to make up their minds about anything, such as brand, and companies are going to have very little control about how they make up their minds. Traditional ways of marketing is going to kind of go out of the window because people are going to make up their minds on their own. And a lot of mining of trends are going to happen. who's working with a guy from one of the, I was just about to give out the name of the company, but I guess I shouldn't. But he said that they routinely open the ports to the data channels on their cell phone, the customers, and get in sensor data, and they can predict with about 98% probability as to who is going to have a back problem in the next 5 years. They don't know why, but they know that all the other 200,000 people they've studied have had back problems, so this other guy was also going to have a back problem, right? The data looks exactly like that, right? So it's amazing what big data can do, and I think that given that in an open global climate, what you get is people playing the price arbitraging business, so that a lot of work, including knowledge creation job and knowledge working jobs, are going to constantly flow out into places that have an advantageous role in price arbitration. It puts a tremendous pressure on every economy to rise very quickly on value creation. And if you just look at what we need to do in terms of solving these big problems and also this other economic issue, value creation suddenly becomes a big issue, right? And I think that what's also happening is that we are all creatures of norms, but the norms are also being created by the larger communities that we are a part of. And that's really worth keeping an eye on as well. And I think that we have Robin here, who's probably the world expert on understanding this. So essentially, what we have is a need for extreme agility, extreme versatility, and creativity. These things are going to be extremely valuable commodities. So the stance that Philadelphia University has taken is essentially placing a very, very strategic bet on these things being important. And we are completely aligned with you on our belief. We have a very, very deep belief in this, right? So a few trends in education. We see early signs that the walls and the absolutely bulletproof, 16-foot thick concrete walls of the silos are beginning to get porous, right? Learning taking place online. A lot of people are asking us to put our lectures online. And we have what are called flipped classes, where the classes, they're absorbing the one-way communication, which is the professor to student communication online, so that we can use the time in class to discuss or to do something else. Really, really interesting trend. A lot of very interactive learning, a lot of learning in blog space and in where they are contributing a whole lot, just as YouTube, something like YouTube has changed the notion of consumption, where consumption and authoring is somewhat of a blurred issue. Learning is having the same thing. Tremendous use of problem-based learning, teamwork in multidisciplinary teams. I think that the grand challenges are changing the sensibilities of the students. I see the statements of purpose of students applying. 10 years ago, they would say, I built Legos as a kid and I'm really creative, and my sister's a designer and I want to be a designer, and so on. And now they're saying, I want to solve the water problem. I've been working with energy storage systems, and I think I want to change the issue. I think the energy issues has a lot to be done. And please let me get into this program because I need the necessary skills in order to really get solar adoption to be higher, or some such thing, right? Very different sensibilities. And I think that this is something, at least I'm seeing in my own sector. We are having very new kinds of conversation with businesses and governments. And we are essentially being asked to come in and help shape policies, et cetera, which meaning we weren't doing even 10 years ago. The other thing that's happening is that innovation is going in both directions and in other ways. So it's going into K through 12, and it's going up to sea level. So on a given day in the D school, you'll see kids running around, and you'll see people in $5,000 suits, right? And something about this is finding relevance across communities. And leadership and communication and the ability to tell stories and so on in a school of engineering, imagine, right? this is like actually, like they're half the people in the building are engineers, and we have people coming in from Pixar and teaching students how to tell stories, right? Because we now think it's extremely important. We think that the story to a concept is like aviation fuel to a jet plane. You know, your concept could be very sophisticated, ain't going very far without a good story, right? So I like to pose this thing, which is, you know, I like this notion of a fishhook question. Essentially, it's the question that you can't easily get out, right? And it tends to occupy the crannies in your space and create more questions. It has this irritating habit, right? But if you take a step back and say, okay, this is the frame, and we are at a very important moment, what are we going to do about it, right? Just that question, what are we going to do about it, spawns a million other questions, right? And I would say that is, to some extent, I've just brought you into my life, right? This is what I think about. And I feel that our disciplines have done this. They have built these deep silos and know how to ask the question at the bottom of the silo, right? So a lot of our disciplines do this brilliantly, and I'm surrounded by people who do this really, really well. Like, you know, I can have a 3-hour-long discussion on the epitaxial liftoff of a thin film on gallium arsenide with the guy who sits next to me, right? So, and that's probably too general a topic for him, right? But essentially what we've done is this: we've created disciplines that are built in silos, and once in a way we drill a hole or we break down a wall, and we create an interdisciplinary center or some such thing. But essentially, we're all looking through perceptual lenses, all colored by our own perception, you know, our perception colored by our fields, at something which is a whole lot more complex and interlaced. And the complexity of what lies beyond has no respect for our disciplinary boundaries, none whatsoever, right? We choose to look at it from our disciplinary lenses, and there are great advantages to doing that. But the problems there are interlaced, and essentially our ability to work at that interlaced layer is very, very crude and unformed compared to our skills at working at the base of the silo, right? So this is where a lot of the action is, right? This is where a lot of thinking needs to be created. This is where we are going to have to create new methodologies. And if we have to do those, we have to create those ecosystem level innovations, we need new platforms. We need new platforms, we need new epistemologies, we need completely new thinking for this transdisciplinary and transagency co-creation. So collaboration is, or it looks a little bit like this. So if you think about anything that is integrated like this is a very, very integrated object, and you can bet that at least people from 30 different disciplines contributed to this, right? And it's a very cooperative, there's a lot of collaboration involved in getting this, right? Because if you had the industrial designer talking to the guy who does the DFM, the design for manufacturability, there would probably be a fairly large pool of blood, right? But they all have to release it by Christmas for a certain price point. It has to look drop dead gorgeous. So, you know, there are forcing functions. But this is a very different thing, where you take a problem and you surround it by people who have very, very different disciplines, who represent very different agencies. But the difference is this. The difference is that if you look at it from a different angle, collaboration doesn't allow people to leave their rubric. They're stuck within what they're doing, and the DFM guy is going to be the DFM guy. But this allows you to create a completely new epistemology in terms of the challenge and create a new rubric, a completely new way of operating in terms of that challenge that might not have existed before, right? So this is the difference between working on familiar problems and hitting it with a familiar tool versus coming across an unfamiliar problem where you have to create new tools. And a lot of the kind of challenges that we are working on, we do not have the luxury of working with familiar tools because they're unfamiliar problems, right? And this is the other thing that happens. Each of us have perceptual lenses, but if you look at a problem from different sides, if you bother to talk to each other, you get a parallax of disciplines. So you see something that any one discipline would not see at all. So this I find this very, very powerful. So a lot of my work is trying to create multi-epistemological and multidisciplinary systems where you create the perceptual lens to see what's beyond. So what I like to do is not be discipline centric but change centric, and surrounding it by a different discipline and characterizing the problem and working back to figure out what we have and what we need and new kinds of things that I need. Right? And using the fact that there's kinship in the way two different people are looking at it, saying, there must be something out there that neither of us are seeing, so let's talk. Okay? So in order to, Randy and Steve have a sandbox which is an entire university. I don't have that level of control over my university, so I'm doing my own little bit big, which is essentially creating a platform for looking at these problems. I call it Change Labs. And essentially, it's three different functions that we have. We're doing research on what constitutes large-scale transformation and creating new processes. But we want the processes and the theories, new theories, to be very, very practice and praxis, essentially. How do you actually implement these? And so there's a lot of feedback loop between the projects that we do, that we are trying to incubate, etc., and the theories that we are coming up with. But we are essentially saying, if this were to scale, what would we do? So we are essentially thinking about a scaling function as well. But we are also trying to answer this question that a lot of our work, the theories and our practices, etc., are much better at the provincial scale, not particularly good at the global scale. But and so we are trying to find ways in which to have things that still have relevance on the ground, but how can they have relevance at the global scale? So we are trying to think about this. And we are saying that we are not going to just look at it in terms of a technology bucket or a business bucket. We're going to make the bookends much broader, and we're going to create fungibility across the system. Just as in a modern day car, you essentially is very fungible as to what you throw on a mechanical system and what you throw on the hardware and what you throw on the software, right? The modern day car would never have come up with a differential. You just control each wheel separately, right? But because that's how we trade off mechanical systems versus electrical systems versus software, etc. But if you make the bookends even broader and say sociological systems, if you can muck with, we will muck with. Behavioral systems, if we muck with, we can. Policy systems, technology systems, business systems creates a much larger canvas that is in keeping with large-scale systems. But of course, you're never going to have the resources to take on. You're not going to have trillions of dollars. So our model is that, can you do acupuncture, right? Can you put in pins in a few places such that the behavior of the system is changed, right? So that's the vision. And so really quickly through a few things, because I don't want to take up too much of your time, but one sample project that we are treating as a platform project is we call the 100-liter water project. So we are saying, what would it take to deliver at least 100 liters per family per day in distributed families in water-stressed regions of the world, right? Now that is an incredibly integrated issue, because water translates to pure water, like and what you need to drink and wash and maintain hygiene, etc., food hygiene, etc. It's linked to soil issues. It's linked to the condition of the aquifers. It's linked to the forest issues, women's issues, employment issues, financial employment, the whole 9 yards, right? So once you start taking it, it's like a fractal that grows and allows you to think about it in a very different way. So this is the question that we're asking. And it looks at infrastructural issues, it looks like social inequity, it looks at food security. It's a very, very integrated issue. So we're looking at it in a very integrated way. we are looking at it from, so we've targeted India. So we are talking to people in the field at the government level. We're talking to cell phone manufacturers. We are talking to people who have existing distribution systems into the village. It's just a very, very integrated way of working. But we are finding completely new models that are exciting. We are finding new financial models that are very exciting. We are finding models that can be created that from the government side, it can look like a dam. And from the other side, it's a highly distributed system. So for the government, essentially, it looks like they're spending it on a dam. So suddenly you have new revenue streams that are very, very exciting. This is a theory-based project where essentially I'm working with a bunch of behavioral economists, social psychologists, neuropsychologists, and cognitive psychologists, and essentially taking their tools, those part of their tools that have to do with changing behavior, not those part of the system that purely describe, because I don't have the bandwidth to learn all that, right? And essentially melding it with innovation techniques and creating new techniques where the behavior change principles are built into the process. And why are we so excited about this? Because in any large system, if you think of it as a set of as spur gears, the one that's gummiest and the most inefficient is the human element. That's where most of the systems come down to their knees, right? And that's where a lot of inefficiency is. And meaning apart from that being the bottleneck, it allows us an ability to come up with demand-side innovations, not just supply-side innovations, which is tremendously important if you're dealing with issues of sustainability, right? You can suddenly have an ability, because the cheapest barrel of oil is the one you don't use. So if you can shift behavior systems such that people use less, it's tremendous. But if there's, of course, a huge amount of disbelief in our ability to modify behavior systems. People say, oh, behavior systems are really hard to change. Well, I'd place a pretty darn good bet that all of you are carrying cell phones in your pockets, right? 10 years ago, I wouldn't be able to place that bet, right? I'd lay $100 bet down. Most of you are, right? That's profoundly, that's a behavior change. So if that could be done, a lot of behavior can be done. So the other thing is that think about what it would take to diffuse a new kind of internal combustion engine and change a fleet of 200 million cars, right? What would it take to change the entire fleet of the US cars if we came up with this fantastic technology? And we have electric cars. Oh, but by the way, they use electricity which has a source to site conversion of 0.6. Until you fix the grid, it's actually worse, because where is all that cadmium going, right? But if you change behavior, like the number of people who jumped onto Facebook, or the number of people who are using Zipcar, that's a pretty profound difference, right? So essentially, the way we are looking at it is that people, societies, systems are caught in behavioral grooves. And can you create another groove, and can you plonk them there, right? And if you do that, what would it take? That's the question we are saying. So if we do that, then, and if you think of it from a resilience theory standpoint, things do change, but they all have their clock tick of how quickly they change, right? A cell changes at a certain rate, an organization changes at a certain rate, an institution changes at a certain rate, a stellar system changes at a certain rate, a galaxy changes at a different rate, right? They all have a certain time constant. How can you outperform the time constant, right? Because some of our systems need to change really quickly, and there are established techniques of how do you outperform the time constant. So this is what we are thinking about. Another thing that we're looking at is energy. We have many projects, but I'm just sharing a few. But we have a project from ARPA-E, and this is government of it's a government-funded project from the Advanced Research Program in energy, and we are looking at behavioral interventions to energy, and we are finding that there is a new layer that did not used to exist in energy, which is information. Information just simply did not exist. And currently, we are in a civilization that we've been conditioned to sticking a plug in a socket and being able to draw energy from it. But that information might change things. And we are finding all these different kinds of ways to do essentially stealth interventions. A stealth intervention is or a piggyback is a kind of intervention where you want to save energy, but you don't want necessarily need the other person to believe in saving the energy. You want the guy who drives the Humvee to save energy, right? So you create a co-benefit that is appealing to them, and you nicely do a switcheroo on them so that they go after the co-benefit, and the benefit that you wanted is a byproduct, right? Sometimes they don't even know that it's happening. So meaning that's one of the categories of stuff that we're doing. So essentially what we're talking about is given the current state of affairs, we are headed towards a future A, and we can debate about whether it's A or A dash, but ultimately it's not a particularly good place we are headed. And the question is, can we go towards a different future? And if that is what we are headed towards, what would it take to change that trajectory? What would it take to create that impact, right? In simplistic terms. So essentially, what would it take to move the dial, right? So last slide, our vision is that the scientific era gave us R&D labs. It gave us departments of science and technology. It gave us funding agencies such as the National Science Foundation, right? That was when science was the big theme. Science is a given. But turbulent futures are what we are up against. Extremely worrisome turbulent futures are what we are up against. What is the equivalent of the R&D unit that should be in every organization? Business units, government units, in education units, etc. Who is looking after this issue of transformation? So we are thinking that just as design thinking is something that within a decade's time became a meme and went from nobody knowing what it is to becoming something everybody understood, we think that this whole way of thinking about scale transformation is actually a way of looking at it that has design thinking built in, but it's also very inclusive because it allows everybody to play this game. Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.